It started out like any other day. My mom had left early in the morning to spend the weekend at her sister's house, which meant it was just me and my stepdad, Greg, home alone. The house was unusually quiet, with only the faint hum of the TV from the living room breaking the silence. I hadn't thought much about it at first, mostly scrolling through my phone and savoring the rare stillness of the house. Greg had been in and out of the house all morning, tending to his usual weekend chores, fixing things, cleaning up, and tinkering with his projects in the garage. He was always doing something, always finding a reason to stay busy. It was one of those things I had always noticed about him. He couldn't sit still. He was constantly moving, always occupied with something. As I lay there on the couch, my eyes glued to the screen, I couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere between us. It wasn't something I could put into words at first, but I could feel it. Greg had always been my stepdad, but lately, it seemed like he wasn't just playing that role anymore. There was something different in the way he looked at me, something in the way he interacted with me that I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't overt, it wasn't like he was saying anything inappropriate or doing anything outright strange, but there was a subtle tension, an unspoken energy that hung in the air between us. At first, I tried to dismiss it, telling myself I was probably imagining things. Maybe I was just overthinking it, I thought. But the more I paid attention, the more I began to realize it wasn't just in my head. There were little moments that stood out, things I hadn't noticed before, or maybe things I had just ignored. Like when he'd pass by me in the kitchen, just a little too close, his hand brushing against my shoulder and lingering there for a second longer than necessary. Or when I'd catch him watching me across the room, his eyes following me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. It wasn't the kind of look that felt safe or fatherly anymore. It felt heavier, loaded with something I couldn't quite name. Sometimes I would feel his gaze lingering on me, and I'd try to pretend I didn't notice, but it made my heart race in a way that unsettled me. It was like he was trying to say something without actually saying it, like there was something he was thinking that he wasn't ready to vocalize. I didn't know if I should confront it, or if I was just being paranoid, but it was hard to ignore. Every time he would come close, I could feel that same quiet tension in the air, a kind of unspoken understanding between us that I wasn't sure how to handle. It made me feel both confused and uncomfortable, like I was caught in a moment I didn't know how to escape from. It was hard to ignore, even though I tried. That afternoon, as I sat there on the couch, the tension in the air felt more palpable than ever. It was as if we were both waiting for something to happen, even though neither of us had said a word about it. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on the movie playing in the background, but I couldn't ignore the sense that today was different. It wasn't long before I heard Greg's footsteps approaching from down the hall. I glanced up, my heart skipping a beat as he stepped into the living room. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, his hair slightly tousled from whatever he had been working on. There was nothing out of the ordinary about his appearance, but the look in his eyes was enough to make me sit up a little straighter. "Hey," he said casually, leaning against the doorway. "You doing okay?" "Yeah," I replied, my voice steady despite the nervous flutter in my chest. "Just watching TV." He nodded, his eyes scanning the room before settling back on me. "Mind if I join you?" I shrugged, trying to act as if his presence wasn't making my pulse quicken. "Sure." Greg crossed the room and sat down beside me on the couch, the cushion sinking slightly under his weight. The space between us felt smaller than usual, and I couldn't help but notice the way his leg brushed against mine as he got comfortable. It was such a small thing, but it set off a chain reaction of thoughts I wasn't ready to face. For a few minutes we sat there in silence, the TV playing in the background, though neither of us seemed to be paying much attention to it. The tension in the air had thickened, and I could feel Greg's presence beside me like a magnet pulling me closer, even though I tried to keep my distance. But the story doesn't end here. After a few minutes, Greg shifted slightly, turning his body toward me. His eyes met mine, and there was something in his gaze that made my breath catch. It wasn't just the casual look of stepfather checking in on his stepson. There was something deeper, something more intense, and it made the space between us feel even smaller. You know, Greg began, his voice low and steady. I've been thinking about you a lot lately. My heart skipped a beat, the weight of his words settling over me like a blanket. I wasn't sure what he meant, but the tone in his voice made it clear that this wasn't a casual conversation. There was something more here, something that had been building between us for a while. About me, I asked, my voice coming out quieter than I had intended. Greg nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. Yeah, I've noticed. Well, I've noticed how things have been between us lately. It's different, isn't it? I didn't know how to respond. He was right. Things had been different, but I hadn't expected him to acknowledge it out loud. The unspoken tension between us had been growing for months, but we had both danced around it, pretending nothing had changed. I guess, I said, unsure of where this conversation was headed. It's just different. Greg smiled, but it wasn't the warm, fatherly smile I was used to. It was something else, something more knowing, more intense. I've noticed how you look at me, he said, his voice soft but deliberate, and I think you've noticed me too. My heart was racing now, the words hanging in the air between us like a challenge. I didn't know how to respond, didn't know what to say. He was right. I had been noticing him more, feeling things I didn't understand, but I had never expected him to bring it up. I don't know, I stammered, my mind racing. Maybe. Greg leaned in slightly, his hand resting on my leg, his fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of my jeans. The touch was small, almost innocent, but it sent a shockwave through me. I couldn't move, couldn't pull away. I just sat there, frozen by the weight of the moment. It's okay, Greg said softly, his hand still resting on my leg. You don't have to be afraid, I've been thinking about this too. His words were calm, reassuring, but they only made my heart race faster. What was he saying, what was he asking? The tension between us had reached a breaking point, and I didn't know what to do. Greg's hand moved slightly, his fingers brushing higher up my leg, and I felt my breath hitch in my throat. The space between us seemed to disappear, and suddenly, it felt like we were standing on the edge of something dangerous, something I didn't know how to navigate. We don't have to do anything, Greg said quietly, his voice soothing. I just wanted to see how you felt. I swallowed hard, my mind a jumble of thoughts and emotions. This was my stepdad, the man who had been in my life for years, the man I had trusted and looked up to. But now, with his hand on my leg and his eyes locked onto mine, everything felt different. I don't know, I whispered, my voice shaky. I don't know what to think. Greg's hand lingered on my leg, his touch warm and steady. That's okay, he said softly, we can take things slow, we don't have to rush into anything. His words were comforting, but they didn't make the tension between us any less intense. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with questions I didn't have answers to. What was happening? What did this mean for us? Greg's hand moved again, this time higher, and I felt a wave of heat rush through me. My body was reacting to him, responding to the touch I had been trying to ignore for so long. And suddenly, I realized that I didn't want to pull away. I didn't want to stop this. I've been thinking about us, Greg said quietly, his eyes never leaving mine. And I think maybe we could try something, just between us. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and thick with meaning. Try something? My mind spun as I tried to make sense of what Greg was saying. My stepdad, the man who had married my mom, was sitting here suggesting. What exactly? My chest tightened with nerves, but at the same time, I felt the tension between us grow stronger, pulling me closer to something I didn't fully understand. Greg's hand still rested on my leg, his fingers tracing slow, deliberate circles against the fabric of my jeans. The touch was light, but it set off a series of sparks that ran up my spine. I couldn't move. I couldn't think straight. I could only sit there, feeling the weight of his words and the warmth of his touch. We don't have to rush into anything, Greg said softly, his voice calm and measured, as though he could sense the storm brewing inside me. I just want to make sure we're both on the same page. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. On the same page? How could I even begin to process what he was asking? How had we gotten here? This was my stepdad, someone who had been a part of my life for years. And yet, now that we were here, now that he had crossed the line and spoken the words neither of us could take back, I realized that I had been waiting for this moment too. I just hadn't let myself admit it. I don't know what to say, I whispered, my voice barely audible. This is all so much. Greg nodded, his hand moving slightly higher up my leg. I get that, he said quietly. And we don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with. But I've noticed the way you look at me, the way things have been between us lately. And I know you feel it too. My heart raced at his words. He was right, I had noticed it. I had felt it, the lingering glances, the quiet moments between us that seemed to hold more weight than they should. There had always been something simmering just beneath the surface, something unspoken but undeniable. And now, here we were, standing on the edge of it, ready to see what was waiting on the other side. Greg shifted closer to me on the couch, his leg brushing against mine, the warmth of his body radiating toward me. The space between us had all but disappeared, and I could feel my breath quicken as I tried to process everything that was happening. I've been thinking about this for a while, Greg said, his voice barely above a whisper. About what it would be like to explore this with you. His words sent a wave of heat rushing through me. Explore this. The suggestion was so clear, so direct, and it sent my mind spinning in ways I wasn't prepared for. But I couldn't deny the pull I felt, the way my body was reacting to his touch, to his presence. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, and yet I didn't feel scared. I felt curious, I felt drawn in. But the story didn't end here. Greg's hand moved up my leg again, his fingers tracing the edge of my thigh, and I felt my breath hitch in my throat. My pulse quickened, my mind a mess of conflicting thoughts, but my body wasn't listening to any of them. I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to pull away. I don't know if we should, I said again, my voice shaking with uncertainty. You're my stepdad. Greg's eyes softened, his hand pausing for a moment as if to give me space to breathe. I know, he said gently, but that doesn't mean we can't explore this. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can just be something between us, something special. His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I could feel the tension between us building to a point of no return. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. This was happening so fast and yet, at the same time, it felt like it had been building for so long. All the moments we had shared, all the times I had caught him watching me from across the room, it had all led to this. I looked into his eyes, searching for something, some kind of answer, some kind of reassurance that this wasn't as crazy as it felt. But all I saw was desire, raw and unfiltered, and it mirrored my own. I didn't know what was happening between us, but I knew I didn't want to stop it. I don't know, I whispered again, my heart racing. Greg's hand moved again, this time resting on my inner thigh, and I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through me. His touch was warm, firm, but gentle, and it made my head spin with the weight of everything that was happening. We can take it slow, he said softly, his fingers brushing against my skin in a way that made it hard to breathe. We don't have to rush into anything, but I think we both know there's something here, something real. I couldn't speak, the words wouldn't come. My mind was too clouded with desire, with the overwhelming need to see where this could go. My body was reacting in ways I hadn't anticipated, ways I couldn't control, and I knew that no matter how much I tried to deny it, I wanted this. And then it happened. Greg leaned in closer, his face just inches from mine now. I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin, and the intensity of the moment made my heart pound in my chest. His hand slid up my thigh, his fingers grazing the edge of my waistband, and I felt a wave of heat rush through me. This was happening. This was real. I've wanted this for a long time, Greg whispered, his voice low and full of desire. I've wanted to feel this with you, to explore this side of us. His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt my body respond to him in ways I hadn't expected. I couldn't deny it anymore. I wanted this too. I wanted to see where this could go, even if it terrified me. I don't know if we should, I said again, but my words were weak, lacking the conviction I had tried to hold on to. Greg smiled, his hand moving up to rest on my waist, his touch firm but gentle. We don't have to decide anything right now, he said softly. We can take our time, but I think you know as well as I do that there's something here. I swallowed hard, my mind racing with the possibilities. This was my stepdad, the man who had been a part of my life for years. But now everything had changed. The lines between us had blurred, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to cross them or if I wanted to step back. Greg leaned in even closer, his lips brushing against my ear as he whispered, "We don't have to rush into anything. We can take it slow. Just see where this goes." I felt a shiver run down my spine at his words, and I knew, deep down, that I couldn't resist this any longer. The tension between us had reached a breaking point, and there was no going back now. Whatever this was, whatever we were about to do, it was inevitable. "Okay," I whispered, my heart racing in my chest. Let's see where this goes." Greg smiled, his eyes dark with desire, and I knew that everything was about to change. The room felt smaller now, more intimate, as if the air between us had thickened with the weight of everything we weren't saying. Greg's hand lingered on my waist, his thumb brushing lightly against my skin, and I couldn't deny the rush of warmth that spread through me. I had agreed to see where this could go, even though I still wasn't sure what this really was. Greg's eyes stayed on mine, searching for something, maybe reassurance, maybe permission. He was close, so close that I could feel his breath on my face, the heat of his body pressing against mine. My heart pounded in my chest, the rhythm so loud I was sure he could hear it too. "Are you okay?" Greg asked softly, his voice a mix of concern and desire. His hand rested lightly on my side, not pushing for more but not pulling away either. I nodded, even though the question felt too simple for everything I was feeling. I wasn't sure if I was okay. This was my stepdad, the man who had been in my life for years, and yet I couldn't deny how my body was reacting to him, how my mind was spinning with thoughts I had never allowed myself to fully entertain before. Greg's hand moved slightly, sliding up my side, his touch firm but gentle, as if he was testing the waters. I could feel my breath hitch in my throat as his fingers grazed my skin, sending waves of heat through me. My body was responding to him in ways I hadn't expected, and I wasn't sure how to process it. "We can stop any time," Greg said quietly, his voice steady but laced with something deeper. "If you don't want to do this, just say the word." I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I tried to find my voice. But the truth was I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to pull away. Whatever this was, whatever we were about to do, I wanted to see it through. There was no turning back now, and the thought of stopping felt impossible. "I don't want to stop," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could think too much about them. My heart raced as I spoke, my body already leaning into him, already betraying the conflict still swirling in my mind. Greg smiled at my words, a slow, knowing smile that sent shivers down my spine. His hand moved higher, sliding under my shirt, and I felt my breath catch in my throat at the sudden contact. His touch was warm, firm, but gentle, and I found myself leaning into him even more, craving the heat of his body against mine. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice low and full of intent. I nodded, barely able to trust my voice. "I'm sure." And with that, the tension between us finally snapped. Greg's hand moved further up my chest, his fingers tracing slow circles against my skin, and I felt my body respond to him with the heat I hadn't expected. His touch was deliberate, careful, but there was an urgency there too, as if he had been waiting for this moment just as long as I had. But the story didn't end here. I could feel the weight of his body shifting as he leaned closer, his face just inches from mine, and I knew what was coming next. His lips brushed lightly against my neck, a feather-soft kiss that sent a jolt of electricity through me. I gasped at the sensation, my heart pounding in my chest as his mouth pressed against my skin again, this time more firmly, more intentionally. The room seemed to tilt as Greg's kisses moved up my neck, slow and deliberate, each one sending a new wave of heat through me. My mind was spinning, my body reacting to him in ways I hadn't anticipated, and I found myself leaning into him, craving the closeness, the intensity of his touch. His hand slid back down to my waist, pulling me closer to him, and I felt my breath hitch in my throat as his body pressed against mine. The space between us had all but disappeared, and it felt like the air itself was crackling with the energy that had built between us over the past few months. I tilted my head back slightly, giving him more access, and I felt his lips press against the sensitive skin just below my ear. The sensation made my body tremble, and I felt a rush of heat spread through me as his hand tightened its grip on my waist. "Greg," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I wasn't even sure what I was going to say, but his name slipped out like a reflex, a plea for something more. Greg pulled back just slightly, his lips hovering near mine now, his breath warm against my skin. His eyes locked onto mine, dark and full of desire, and for a moment we just stared at each other, the intensity of the moment making it hard to breathe. And it didn't end there. Before I could say anything, before I could even process what was happening, Greg closed the distance between us, his lips pressing against mine in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative, as if he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I leaned into him, kissing him back, my body responding to the heat of his touch, the intensity of the moment. The kiss deepened, slow but full of desire, and I felt Greg's hand slide up my back, pulling me closer to him. The warmth of his body pressed against mine, and I couldn't help but melt into him, letting the kiss take over, letting the intensity of the moment wash over me. I wasn't thinking about anything else, just him, just the way his lips felt against mine, the way his touch sent shivers down my spine. It was like all the tension, all the unspoken desire that had been building between us for so long was finally spilling over, and I didn't want it to stop. Greg's hand moved up to my hair, his fingers tangling in the strands as he deepened the kiss, his body pressing even closer to mine. I could feel my heart racing, my pulse quickening as the intensity of the moment grew. It was overwhelming, all-consuming, and I didn't care about anything else in that moment except for him. We finally broke apart, both of us breathless, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to catch our breath. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind still reeling from everything that had just happened, and I could see the same mix of emotions in Greg's eyes, desire, confusion, and something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable. "This changes everything," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. Greg nodded, his hand still resting on my waist, his thumb brushing lightly against my skin. "I know," he said softly, "but maybe that's okay." I looked into his eyes, searching for some kind of reassurance, some kind of understanding, and in that moment I realized that I didn't regret any of it. The confusion, the tension, the desire, it was all still there, but so was something else, something that made me feel like this was exactly where I was supposed to be. We sat there for a moment, the room filled with the quiet aftermath of everything that had just unfolded between us. The weight of what had happened was undeniable, but there was no regret, just the lingering heat from Greg's touch and the rhythm of my racing heart. His hand stayed on my waist, a constant grounding presence, as if he was making sure I wasn't going to pull away. For the first time in what felt like hours, I let myself breathe. Deep, steady breaths, trying to take in everything at once. Greg's eyes were still on me, watching, waiting for my next move, but he wasn't rushing anything. He seemed as caught in the moment as I was, unsure of what came next but certain we had crossed a line we couldn't undo. I shifted slightly, pulling back just enough to meet Greg's gaze fully. His eyes were dark, full of emotion and something deeper that made my pulse quicken again. The tension between us hadn't disappeared, it had just changed, becoming something more tangible, something we both knew we couldn't ignore any longer. "This is different now," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the quiet room. Greg nodded, his hand tightening slightly on my waist, as if to anchor me in place. "I know," he said, his voice soft but steady, "and I'm okay with that if you are." I wasn't sure how to respond. Part of me wanted to say that I didn't know what this meant, that everything felt too big, too fast. But another part of me, the part that had leaned into his touch, that had kissed him back without hesitation, was ready to embrace whatever this was, ready to see where it would lead. "We'll figure it out," Greg said, as if sensing my hesitation. His voice was calm, reassuring, but there was a flicker of something deeper there, something that told me he had been thinking about this for longer than I realized. "We don't have to rush anything, we can take it slow." Slow, the word felt comforting, like a lifeline in the midst of all the confusion. We didn't have to have all the answers right now, we didn't have to define what this was or where it was going, we just had to be here in this moment, together. "I don't want things to get complicated," I said softly, my voice barely a whisper. "This is new, and I don't know how we're supposed to handle it." Greg smiled, a small, knowing smile that made my chest tighten. "Things are already complicated," he said, his thumb brushing gently over my side. "But that doesn't mean it has to be bad. We'll handle it together." His words were reassuring, but they didn't erase the reality of what we were doing. This was my stepdad, a man who had been part of my family for years. And yet, in that moment, he didn't feel like family. He felt like something else entirely, something I hadn't let myself imagine until now. But the story didn't end there. I nodded slowly, still trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. Greg leaned in slightly, his forehead resting against mine, and I felt the familiar warmth of his presence wrap around me like a blanket. It was comforting, but it was also charged with something I couldn't ignore. The desire was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. "You don't have to decide anything right now," Greg whispered, his voice low and full of intent. "We'll figure it out as we go." His words were a promise, one I wasn't sure I was ready to fully accept, but one that made me feel a little less afraid of whatever came next. There was no going back now, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe we had been headed in this direction all along. Greg's hand moved up my back, his fingers brushing against my skin in a way that made me shiver. I could feel the heat between us growing again, and I knew that the tension we had just broken wasn't going away anytime soon. It was still there, pulsing with every beat of my heart, every slow breath we took together. "We'll figure it out," I whispered, echoing his words, more to reassure myself than him. "One step at a time." Greg smiled, his lips brushing lightly against my forehead in a soft, lingering kiss. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of everything we had shared in the last hour. The kiss wasn't urgent or rushed like before. It was patient, gentle, a quiet promise that whatever happened next, we would take it slow. As the minutes ticked by, we stayed close, our bodies still tangled together on the couch. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was filled with the quiet understanding that things had changed, but we didn't need to rush into figuring out exactly how. We could take our time. There was no need to force answers where there weren't any yet. Eventually, Greg pulled back slightly, his hand moving from my waist to gently cup my face. His eyes searched mine, as if he was still looking for reassurance, still wanting to make sure I was okay with what had happened. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he said softly, his voice full of sincerity. "If this is too much, we can take a step back." I shook my head, my chest tightening with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. "No," I said quietly. "I don't want to go back. I want to take it slow." Greg smiled again, a warm, genuine smile that made my heart flutter. "We will," he promised. "Slow is fine." For the first time since this all began, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The confusion was still there, the questions still looming, but for now, it didn't feel overwhelming. We didn't have to figure everything out at once. We could take our time, see where this went, and let things unfold naturally. As the sun began to set outside, casting a soft, golden glow across the room, Greg and I sat in comfortable silence, our hands still intertwined. I knew this was just the beginning. There were still challenges ahead, still things we would have to face, but in that moment none of it felt impossible. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. But maybe that wasn't a bad thing. Maybe it was the start of something new, something neither of us had been ready to admit until now. As the night slowly crept in, I leaned back against the couch, my body still pressed against Greg's, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like things were exactly as they should be.